Hey everyone, tonight we're re-diving into the fascinating lives and scandal-filled bedrooms of a few medieval queenswomen who turned this controversy into an art form centuries before gossip columns existed. Before we get started, make sure you hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy my content. Drop a comment to let me know where you're rewatching from and what time it is. I always love seeing the mix of places tuning in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. And let's drift together into tonight's tales. Joanna of Naples was crowned in 1343, and right from the beginning decided that rules were more like guidelines. Tradition was optional in marriage, okay? Well, that was more of a revolving door. She walked down the aisle 4 times, which wasn't unheard of for royals back then, except Joanna had the curious tendency of outlasting her husbands, sometimes a little too conveniently. Her first, Andrew of Hungary, barely survived their honeymoon year. He was found dangling from a window, written off as an unfortunate accident. Few believed it. Joanna didn't care. One legend gave Joanna her most notorious reputation. Supposedly, she had a trapdoor installed beneath her bed. After a night of passion, the unlucky man would plunge straight into the castle moat. It's likely a tall tale invented by her enemies or an especially salty ex, but it stuck because it suited her aura perfectly. Joanna ruled Naples with poise and drama. Some saw her as charming, others as lethal. A few wisely decided she was both. She faced down wars, PayPal disapproval, and endless whispers about her personal life, all while wearing her crown with unapologetic confidence. When she was eventually strangled, probably by rivals, maybe by a lie, she left behind a trail of power, gossip, and songs that Italians would sing for centuries. Joanna wasn't just a queen, she was a walking headline before headlines existed. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't simply live in the 12th century, she practically directed it. First Queen of France, then Queen of England, and mother to 2 kings. She wasn't playing the Game of Thrones, she was rewriting it. Married at 15 to Louis VII of France, she found herself tied to a man more devoted to prayer than passion, radiating all the energy of a cousin marriage gone wrong. Eleanor, by contrast, was sharp, wealthy, and restless. Their marriage collapsed during the Second Crusade. Louis treated it like a holy pilgrimage. Eleanor treated it like a fashion tour with a side of possible romance with her dashing uncle, the Prince of Antioch. Rumors spread, Louis sulked, and by Damascus, the union was beyond saving. Freed, Eleanor wasted no time marrying Henry Plantagenet, future King of England. He was fiery, impulsive, and 11 years younger, exactly her type. Together, they produced 10 children, endless wars, and one of the most passive-aggressive courts in Europe. But Eleanor wasn't just raising heirs, she was cultivating culture. At Poitiers, she hosted poets and popularized courtly love, where noble women were idolized from a respectful distance by knights with strong jaws and weak emotional restraint. Of course, no one respected the distance part. It was all stolen glances, music, and rendezvous behind curtains. When Henry's wandering, I grew too much. Eleanor backed her sons in rebellion. Henry locked her away for 16 years, but for her, imprisonment was just time to write, drink wine, and plot payback through her children. Margaret of Burgundy seemed like the perfect royal bride, impeccable lineage, married to the French heir, graceful in gowns, and free of poisoning scandals. On paper, flawless. In reality, far from it. Her husband Louis, later Louis X, was famously dull, with the charm of cold cabbage. Okay? Their marriage was tedious, and Margaret eventually sought thrills elsewhere. Okay? By 1314, whispers about her and 2 fellow princesses lit up France. Locking 3 young royal women in a castle with little to do turned out to be a recipe not for embroidery, but for intrigue and secret affairs. Entered the Tour de Nestle affair scandal with a title so dramatic it could have been the pilot episode of a medieval soap opera. According to chroniclers, Margaret and her sister, La Blanche, secretly entertained two dashing Norman knights. Their meeting spot, the Tour de Nesle, a royal tower on the sands, secluded, a little eerie, and conveniently discreet for whispers and not-so-innocent rendezvous. Their secret unraveled thanks to the least glamorous of clues: pillowcases. Yes, the knights were recognized because their bedding matched the luxury linens from the princess's chambers. In the end, the doom of queens and knights alike was sealed not by spies or poisons, but by poor laundry decisions. King Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law and monarch of France, was outraged. The knights endured torture and were executed with theatrical brutality. Margaret herself was locked away in Chateau Galliard, the fortress about as bleak as its name wasn't. Within 2 years, she was dead, whether from sickness, smothering, or her husband's desire to tidy up his reputation before taking the throne. Medieval history is vague on the details and frustratingly silent on whether the pillowcases were ever returned. Margaret's downfall wasn't treason or sorcery, was simply misplaced charm with the wrong men in the wrong tower, accessorized by the wrong bed linens. Isabella of France had everything a medieval queen could wish for: royal pedigree, a glittering crown, elegant Parisian footwear, and a husband she quickly learned to despise. In 1308, she married Edward II of England, a tall and handsome king who devoted far more affection to his male companions than to his bride. The first rival for her husband's attention was Piers Gaveston, a flamboyant knight whose love of fine clothes was matched only by his lack of political sense. Edward showered him with titles, estates, and affection usually reserved for queens. At their coronation feast, Gaveston dripped with jewels that outshone Isabella's. She noticed Gaveston was eventually banished, recalled, expelled again, and finally executed by irritated nobles unimpressed with his arrogance. Isabella may or may not have mourned, but the drama only escalated when Edward replaced him with Hugh Despenser. A man so greedy and reviled, he made Gaveston look harmless. Despenser took over not just the king's chambers, but the kingdom's finances, councils, and noble estates while publicly humiliating the queen. Insulting royalty was rarely a wise tactic. By 1326, Isabella was done. She left for France under the guise of diplomacy, taking along her son, the future Edward III. In France, she met Roger Mortimer, a rebellious noble with broad shoulders, a sharp mind, and no inconvenient wife. Together, they orchestrated a full-scale invasion of England. Yes, a queen returned with her teenage son and her lover to conquer her husband's throne, and it worked. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate. What followed was murky. Edward died in prison under suspicious circumstances. A notorious rumor claimed a red-hot poker played a role modern historians doubted, but either way, Isabella's hands weren't spotless. For years, she ruled as regent beside Mortimer, sharing authority and, most likely, a bed, until her son grew weary of their dominance and ousted them. Isabella spent her later years in comfortable confinement, ending her story not in disgrace, but in legend. Agnes of Navarre was born into a dynasty steeped in verse, politics, and carefully sharpened rivalries. The daughter of a king and sister of a troubadour queen, she grew up where wit was a weapon, alliances were fragile, and a romantic entanglement could be salvation or destruction. She married into the crown of Aragon by wedding James II's grandson, King James IV. Unfortunately, her royal spouse was less gallant knight and more unhinged tyrant, haunted, paranoid, and prone to shouting accusations at the curtains. Agnes responded the way many noblewomen did when trapped in impossible marriages. She looked elsewhere for comfort, quietly, repeatedly, and with a taste for variety. Chroniclers claim her list of companions ranged from knights and courtiers to musicians, and possibly even a monk with a shaky commitment to his vows. She was witty, refined, and fluent in the art of flirtation, a skill in Aragon's court far more practical than Latin, and arguably more dangerous. Yeah. But in castles with thin walls and idle servants, secrets had a short shelf life. Whispers started circulating, and soon her affairs became more popular reading than the Psalms. To be clear, Agnes was never officially exposed. No trials, no forced confessions. Yet people around her began meeting suspiciously grim fate's arrival here. A gossiping maid there, even a courtier who somehow stumbled into a brimming moat. Was Agnes responsible? We'll never know. But the kitchen staff did reportedly start locking the spice cupboards whenever she strolled by, just in case. When her husband finally died astonishingly, not by her hand, Agnes retreated to a convent. Not out of remorse, but because it was customary. Noble women went there to pray, read, and politely outlive their scandals. She never remarried, either because no man dared, or because she found serenity among nuns who didn't pry. Agnes of Navarre left no heirs, only a legacy. Murmurs in palace corridors, rumors in poetry, and a warning in every love song that ended too abruptly. Joanna of Castile was royalty by birth, queen by marriage, and a tragic lesson in loving too fiercely. She wed Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, and the nickname was no exaggeration. With his flowing blonde hair, striking legs, the smug grin that implied he'd never touch a chore. Philip was considered the medieval heartthrob. Joanna, for all her regal poise, fell hard. Their marriage burned bright, then burned out. Philip was magnetic, ambitious, and allergic to fidelity. At first, he strayed in whispers, then in spectacles worthy of a bad romance ballad. Joanna did not take betrayal lightly. She erupted in jealous fury, interrogated his mistresses, and, according to some tales, tried her hand at hair-pulling diplomacy. But fate twisted stranger still. In 1506, Philip suddenly dropped it dead supposedly from drinking cold water after a game of ball. Even for the 16th century, that was a flimsy excuse. Joanna's grief went far beyond the traditional veil and prayer kind, which clung to him literally. She had his coffin opened again and again to make sure he was still there, kissed his corpse, and even forbade women from approaching it, lest they be tempted. Death hadn't made Philip less of a liability. She traveled with his coffin across Castile, sleeping beside it in monasteries. And if some hushed rumors are to be believed, perhaps more. Chroniclers grew vague, whether out of respect or sheer discomfort. Her behavior unnerved the court. Eventually, her father, Ferdinand, declared her insane and confined her to a convent, where she remained for 46 long years. Was Joanna truly mad, or just shattered by a husband who betrayed her until the end? Historians still argue. What is certain is that she became one of history's only queens remembered more for devotion to her dead husband than for any acts among the living. Now, before we go further, let's clear something up. Catherine the Great did not die during a romantic encounter with a horse. The sheer fact, we have to say, that tells you how wildly her reputation spun out of control once she made enough enemies. Technically, outside the medieval period, Catherine deserves her place here on scandal quotient alone. Born a minor German princess, she married into Russian royalty and soon discovered that her husband, Peter III, was less of a Tsar and more of an overgrown boy with toy soldiers and a questionable love for Prussia. He adored military games, neglected his empire, and ignored his wife. So Catherine, trapped in a frigid marriage, did what many ambitious women in impossible situations might. She turned her gaze elsewhere. She had lovers, many of them, officers, nobles, poets, even, if whispers are true, a craftsman or two. Some were younger, some dangerously competent. One was barely 18 when she was 60, which honestly sounds less scandalous and more inspirational if you think about it. But Catherine wasn't reckless. She was deliberate. She rewarded her favorites with estates and titles, essentially running a royal rewards program. Please the empress, and you left with land, wealth, and perhaps a pension. Fail to deliver. there was always exile. Now, about that infamous rumor. After her death, either bitter enemies or very bored aristocrats claimed Catherine had died during intimacy with a horse. The story was absurd, biologically impossible, and should have been dismissed outright. But it lingered. Why? Because Catherine was a powerful woman who ruled without a man. She passed reforms, crushed uprisings, and told the church to keep its nose out of state affairs. For her critics, the only way to diminish her was with barnyard slander. In truth, she died of a stroke in bed, fully clothed and completely free of livestock. Yet the smear stuck, because scandal is always more entertaining than fact. Catherine didn't need a horse to shock people. Her reign alone made her unforgettable. She may not have mounted animals, but she certainly wrote history like she owned it. If you picture medieval queens quietly stitching embroidery by candlelight, meet Fredegund of Neustria, woman who believed in wifely duty, royal dignity, and stabbing enemies when necessary. Born a servant, Fredegund climbed the ranks with a mix of charisma and probably corpses. She caught the eye of King Chilperic, the first of Neustria, who was married, though not for long. His first wife died under suspicious circumstances shortly after Fredegund appeared. The second, Galswintha, was strangled in her bed not long after the wedding. Fredegund denied involvement with the tone of someone holding a pillow and insisting it proved nothing. Once queen, she didn't mellow. She escalated. She kept a dagger under her pillow, not symbolically, but literally, because in her world, bedtime was just another battlefield. Political opponents were poisoned. Who insulted her vanished. Servants who gossiped ended up very quiet. Her feud with her sister-in-law, Brunhilde of Austrasia, became legendary, a decades-long grudge match that resembled a royal mean girls war, only with assassins instead of insults. Fredegund even dispatched a hitman to stab Brunhilde's son during mass. Subtle, she was not. Even after her husband was himself conveniently murdered, Fredegund ruled as regent for her son, Clothar II. She crushed uprisings, handled diplomacy, and if rumors are right, a few more victims to her tally along the way. She inspired not just fear, but respect, though mostly the kind you mutter through clenched teeth. And yet, in the ultimate plot twist, she died peacefully in bed. For a woman who was the human embodiment of a blade, it almost feels like the scribes made a mistake. Fredegund wasn't just someone who slept with knives. She was the knife, sharp, ruthless, and always ready. She makes most other queens look like they were playing at royalty with wooden spoons. Anne Boleyn was never destined to be queen. She was destined to be unforgettable, clever, stylish, and fluent in the art of strategic eyebrow raises. She could command a room full of powdered nobles who thought Latin alone made them desirable. She arrived at the English court in the early 1500s like a fashionable thunderstorm. Not a conventional beauty by some reports, but magnetic in a "I'm smarter than you, and I know it" sort of way. King Henry VIII took one look and promptly forgot he already had a wife. Unfortunately for Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne wasn't interested in being just another royal mistress. Her ambitions reached higher. Crown high, Henry pursued her relentlessly, writing love letters that read like a mix of obsession and teenage melodrama. He split his kingdom from Rome, created the Church of England, shattered centuries of traditional to a no-one marriage, and slipped a ring on an ambitious finger that wasn't courtship, was state-backed seduction. Once she wore the crown, Anne Boleyn wasn't the type to sit quietly and churn out heirs. Outspoken, and openly disliked by much of the court, mostly because she said exactly what she thought and wasn't. Dazzled by shallow flattery. She also had a habit of teasing Henry in public, which, while entertaining, was a risky move given his history with wives. Then came the problem. No male heirloom, one daughter, Elizabeth, who would later rule England like a legend. But at the time was a bitter disappointment to a king obsessed with sons. Suddenly, Anne's wit and charm no longer worked in her favor. The whispers began. Affairs with courtiers, incest with her brother, witchcraft, treason. Most of it was laughably absurd, even for Tudor politics. But Henry was restless and looking for an exit daily, one involving an executioner. Anne was arrested, dragged through a trial that would make a kangaroo court look fair, and sentenced to die. A French swordsman was imported for the occasion, because if you're going to kill your wife, why not add a little continental flair? Anne Boleyn lost her head, but not her place in history. She remains the queen who gambled everything, won the crown, and lost it awesomely because she dared to refuse before she agreed. Some queens rose through scandal, some through seduction. Christina of Denmark, however, rose through sheer survival instinct and the ability to deliver the perfect verbal slap without smudging her lipstick. Born into Danish royalty in 1521, she was married off young, like so many noble girls who were essentially velvet-wrapped diplomatic contracts. Her husband, the Duke of Milan, died not long after, leaving Christina a widow at 16, which, oddly enough, was considered a stroke of luck. She had freedom, money, and nobody droning about taxes over dinner. Enter Henry VIII, freshly divorced, impatient, and already with one wife buried well. Technically, Key sent a painter to capture Christina's likeness and gauge her suitability. Christie, politically shrewd and not at all eager to become wife number 3 or target. Key, number 3, famously replied, "If I had 2 heads, I would gladly put one at the disposal of the King of England." That wasn't just a refusal. That was a burn worthy of marble inscription. Unsurprisingly, Henry was not amused. Still, he kept chasing her, because nothing says romance like ignoring a perfectly clear insult and pushing marriage plans anyway. Christina, however, wisely chose heir over execution and married a duke who didn't make beheading his favorite pastime. She lived in comfort, ruled competently, and kept her head firmly attached for the rest of her life, a historic win by any standard. Later, she even served as regent, dabbled in military strategy, and collected portraits because sometimes admiration is safer when it doesn't, come attached to a proposal from a man with a sword obsession. Christina never became England's queen, but her one-liner became legend. Proof that sometimes the greatest power move isn't taking the crown, but dodging it with style. Fast forward nearly 500 years, and we arrived at Maria of Portugal, who began her royal journey like many other noble women, reluctantly married to a man twice her age, expected to smile politely and produce heirs without asking questions. She became wife to Alfonso XI of Castilla, warrior king with an ego the size of Toledo, and a mistress he openly paraded. Not in secret, he flaunted Leonor alike. She was the real queen, giving her attention, luxury, and legitimacy in everything but title. Maria, unsurprisingly, was furious. She gave Alfonso a proper heir, Peter, later known as the Cruel, while Leonor produced 10 illegitimate children and received the royal affection Maria never did. When Alfonso died, Maria finally seized her moment. She returned to Portugal with her teenage son and clung to him with a devotion historians politely call protective, as polite voices called it obsessive, especially given the strangely intense bond between them. Peter grew up, fell passionately in love, and secretly married his mistress, Inés de Castro. Maria was livid. Some say it was because Inés came from lower nobility. Others whisper it was because Maria didn't want to share Peter with any woman. Either way, things spiraled. According to one dramatic account, Maria even encouraged Inés's assassination. Peter's revenge was the stuff of Gothic legend. After Inés was killed, he declared her his lawful wife, exhumed her corpse, placed it on the throne, and forced nobles to kiss her decaying hand. The classic, balanced royal reaction. Did Maria actually orchestrate the murder? Maybe, maybe not. But her name echoed in hushed whispers behind palace walls for decades. Later in life, she faded from the political spotlight, and Mayor may not have started privately calling herself an empress. There's no solid proof she went fully unhinged. But she did spend a suspicious amount of time gazing out windows and scribbling letters no one ever bothered to read. Maria of Portugal never truly got the affection she craved, but she secured a lifetime supply of palace drama, rumors, and the infamous reputation of being the mother-in-law from medieval hell. Olga of Kiev, on the other hand, was not a woman anyone should have tested her, even side-eyed. When her husband, Prince Igor, was gruesomely killed by the Drevlians in 945, they made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed his widow would mourn quietly and then graciously accept a marriage proposal from their prince, because, obviously, the woman whose husband they had just tied 2 trees and torn apart was dying to cut cake at their wedding. Olga played along, smiled sweetly, and promised to consider it. Then she burned everything down. Her revenge was a masterclass in escalating horror. First, she welcomed the Drevlians' ambassadors while they lounged in their boats. She had the entire vessels hauled into pits and buried alive in unforgettable opening act. Then she asked for more noble envoys. Once they arrived, she offered them a bathhouse to relax. The doors locked. The flames rose, and of suitors. Still unsatisfied, she marched to their capital, demanded a feast in her husband's honor, got everyone drunk, and had her troops massacre about 5,000 men. Less a banquet, more a blood-drenched seminar on why widows should not be underestimated. And then came the grand finale. The birds. When the Drevlians finally begged for peace, Olga agreed to lift the siege. If each household gave her 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows, they thought it merciful. Instead, she tied burning sulfur-soaked cloth to their legs and released them. Naturally, the birds flew back to their nests inside thatched roofs, barns, and wooden homes, turning the entire city into a synchronized inferno. A firestorm, courtesy of Team Olga. Later, she converted to Christianity and was canonized as a saint, proving history has a wicked sense of humor. One century, you're torching cities with pigeons. The next, you're venerated as a symbol of faith and wisdom. Olga didn't whisper, charm, or scheme. She annihilated. And somehow, she still got her halo. As for Lucretia Borgia, she never wore a crown. But don't be fooled. She controlled hearts, beds, and suspiciously convenient deaths with more finesse than many crowned monarchs who commanded armies. Born in 1480 into the infamous Borgia family, red flag in itself, Lucretia was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, that pope. Technically supposed to be celibate, but the Borgias treated scripture as more of a flexible guideline, mixing nepotism with Renaissance-level desire. Lucretia was married off repeatedly in political deals. Husbands either died unexpectedly, ran for their lives, or found themselves in very awkward situations under mysterious conditions. One unlucky spouse, Giovanni Sforza, even insisted he'd been pressured to annul their marriage on grounds of non-consummation. In other words, the family didn't exactly hide their opinion. They openly claimed he was far too dull in bed for Lucretia's taste. Subtlety was clearly not their strong suit. And then came the gossip. Endless, colorful gossip. That she wore a hollow ring packed with poison. That she was romantically involved with her brother Cesar. That she bore a child whose father was officially unknown, possibly even the Pope himself. Medieval rumors weren't coy. They didn't hint. They barreled straight into soap opera territory. Was any of it true? Almost certainly not. But whispers don't need proof. Lucretia was striking, clever, multilingual, and a master of courtly spectacle, which in 15th century Rome meant lavish feasts, power games, and perhaps the occasional murder dressed up as entertainment. Yet, beneath all the chaos, Lucretia eventually settled into a quieter life as Duchess of Ferrara. She ran a flourishing court, championed the arts, and spent more time with poetry than with poisons. Honestly, it feels like watching a lion retire to gardening. Still, her legend endured. The Borgia name remained soaked in scandal. Krisha became its most glamorous phantom, part truth, part dazzling invention. Her sharpest weapon was never poison or seduction. It was uncertainty. Predictably devoured it. Wu Zixin, meanwhile, began her imperial journey in the traditional way as a teenage concubine to Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. One among many, she was pretty, quiet, and observant. But she played the long game as if it were a competitive sport with no rule book. When the emperor died, Wu, like all childless concubines, was sent to a Buddhist convent. She prayed, she meditated, and she plotted. Somehow, she captured the attention of the next emperor, Taizong's son, Gaozong. Yes, she seduced her former stepson, and yes, it was every bit as awkward as it sounds. Back at court, Wu returned with sharpened ambitions and no illusions about loyalty. Once empress, she treated the palace like a battlefield. Rivals were exiled, executed, or framed. Cunning political opponents vanished into cautionary tales. Even her own children, warranty-safe rumors, claimed she smothered her infant daughter to frame the former empress. Extreme. Certainly, but Wu wasn't interested in subtlety. She was interested in victory. When Gaozong's health declined, Wu effectively ruled through him, around him, and eventually without him. After his death, she made her boldest move. She declared herself Emperor of China, the first and only woman to do so in her own name. She didn't govern from behind a screen. She wore the robes, sat on the throne, and issued the decrees. Confucian scholars were horrified. Wu was unbothered. And under her, the empire prospered. Agriculture thrived. Schools expanded. Bureaucracy became stronger. So did the number of mysterious deaths at court. Of course, the rumors multiplied. Secret lovers, orgies, assassinations by golden box. A woman couldn't possibly rule through competence, her critics reasoned. It had to be witchcraft, seduction, or sorcery. No, we ignored them. She ruled for over 40 years, died in her 80s, and left behind the legacy of a woman who had outlasted them all. Queen Tamar of Georgia, by contrast, presided over what later generations would call the Georgian Golden Age. Two court poets, it was also an age of divine light, glorious victories, and impossibly romantic devotion. Crowned King of Kings in 1184, Tamar rejected being treated as a mere queen consort. She was sovereign in her own right. When nobles pushed her into a politically convenient marriage, she picked a Russian prince known for drunkenness, married him, and swiftly exiled him when his antics got unbearable. After that, she ruled alone. Her reign expanded Georgia's borders, filled its coffers, and produced enough poetry to sink the Black Sea in verse. But her poets especially showed to Rustaveli wrote of her with such passionate reverence that later historians began to wonder. It's epic. The knight in the panther skin described a queen who ruled over all, spied absolute devotion, and looked suspiciously like Tamar dressed in metaphor. Did she have admirers beyond the poetic? Perhaps. Rumors whispered of private retreats, discreet companions, and late-night discussions that weren't about policy. Still, Tamar was canonized as a saint after her death. Remarkable feat, considering her reign included crusades, rebellions, and the occasional exile of inconvenient lovers. She passed peacefully, surrounded by loyal nobles, her legacy both sacred and ever so slightly scandalous. She didn't need rumor to be remembered, but rumor made her unforgettable. As for Christmas in the Middle Ages, forget the single day you know now. Back then, Christmas stretched across 12 days from December 25th to January 6th, each with its own rituals, saints, and excuses for revelry. December 25th was solemn and holy, but after weeks of Advent, fasting, and restraint, the floodgates opened. Music, feasts, and drinking that could put a monastery into debt. The poor ate meat. The rich served banquets, so lavish they seemed like theater. December 26th was St. Stephen's Day, when people gave food to the poor, an early form of Boxing Day, but with prayer instead of sales. December 28th, Holy Innocents' Day. Sometimes put children in charge of households for the day. Yes, the kids ruled, and predictably, chaos followed. By January 1st, the feast of the circumcision, most were exhausted, overfed, and half-drunk, but they trudged on. The festivities reached their peak on January 6th, Epiphany, when the visit of the Magi was celebrated with masquerades, disguises, and role reversals, peasants as kings. Kings pretending to laugh. A medieval Christmas was in wrapping paper and cocoa by the fire. Okay? It was a 2-week carnival of sacred devotion, wild excess, and social topsy-turvy. Forget the Christmas trees too. They didn't catch on until later. Medieval halls glowed with holly, ivy, bay, and mistletoe, evergreen symbols of eternal life borrowed from pagan solstice rites. If it stayed green in winter, it got hung up. The true centerpiece, however, was the boar's head, not just dinner decoration. Imagine a roasted pig's head with an apple in his jaws, carried into the hall while musicians sang the boar's head carol. Nothing said Merry Christmas quite like a pig staring you down from the banquet table. Feasting took place in vast, echoing halls, not cozy cottages. Walls were hung with tapestries, floors strewn with rushes, and the air heavy with roast goose, spiced wine, and unwashed bodies. Minstrels played, monks drank too much, and merriment spilled on 4 nights. In the absence of pine trees, symbolism carried the day. Holly's sharp leaves were called Christ's crown of thorns. Its red berries, the drops of his blood. Evergreen life in the dead of winter, pagan, Christian, and festive, all at once. Ivy, clinging and twining, symbolized the faithful's dependence on God. It was a theological houseplant arrangement. Mistletoe, on the other hand, was a bit racier, associated with fertility and Norse myths. It wasn't always church approved. That didn't stop medieval revelers from hanging it in doorways. If you stood beneath it, tradition dictated you could be kissed, often forcibly. The church didn't love that part. But let's be honest, the medieval church didn't love a lot of things, and people still did them. So, if you walked into a medieval manor during Christmas, it would feel part holy sanctuary, part bacchanalian forest feast. Evergreen boughs hanging from the rafters, candles flickering on long wooden tables, roasted meats sweating on trays, someone trying to remember which corner had the mistletoe and which one had the chamber pot. Okay? In the Middle Ages, Christmas feasting wasn't just a nice meal. Hey, it was an edible declaration of power, piety, and sheer gluttony. For the nobility, it was an opportunity to show off their wealth through a parade of absurdly overthought dishes. For the peasants, it was the one time a year they might get actual meat. Either way, everyone ate like tomorrow was doomsday, which, given the plague and famine situation, wasn't entirely irrational. The star of the show was often the boar's head. Yes, again, but that was just the beginning. Roasted peacock served in its own iridescent feathers, swan glazed with spices, pies so large they could hide a live bird, ate, and occasionally did. There were stews thick with root vegetables, half-baked bread, sweetmeats, pottages, and satellis, elaborate edible sculptures made of marzipan, sugar, or dough shaped like castles, angels, or dragons. Medieval food wasn't subtle. And let's not forget the drinks. Was a hot spiced ale or cider was passed around in communal bowls. The word was literally meant be well or be in good health, but the effect was usually the opposite. Another favorite was hypercar, a spiced wine sweetened with honey and served warm. These drinks weren't just festive, they were functional. After weeks of Advent fasting, your stomach needed a little help handling the tidal wave of goose fat and barley bread. But these feasts weren't casual buffets. They were carefully staged performances. High-status guests were served first and seated closest to the fire. Lower ranking folk got the scraps. unless you were at a monastery where equality was the rule. But the food was infinitely more boring. Still, even monks broke their vegetarian rules for Christmas. Nothing says baby Jesus is born like a leg of mutton and a jug of wine. Food was central to the medieval Christmas because it was rare to have so much of it. For much of the year, people scraped by on porridge and cabbage. Christmas was the moment the social contract agreed. Yes, let us all get uncomfortably full together. Hey, if you thought one feast was enough, think again. Each of the 12 days had its own meal, its own host, and often its own theme. By the time Epiphany rolled around, most celebrants were spiritually uplifted, emotionally drained, and physically bloated. Do you think modern Christmas gets a little chaotic with family drama and overcooked turkey? The Middle Ages said, "Hold my wassail." The Lord of Misrule, a real position often filled by a fool, a servant, or some mischievous cleric chosen to oversee the Christmas revelries. His job, turn the world upside down and make everything delightfully inappropriate. The Lord of Misrule was the human embodiment of holiday madness. For the duration of the 12 days, he might preside over mock court sessions where people were tried for ridiculous crimes like stealing sausages or having an ugly hat. His court was filled with jesters, musicians, and other agents of mischief. This was licensed anarchy wrapped in bells and tinsel. During his reign, hierarchies could be reversed. Servants gave orders, students punished teachers, choir boys dressed as bishops. It was part carnival, part spiritual exercise in humility. Medieval people believed that flipping the social order temporarily helped reinforce it in the long run. You let off steam for 12 days so the rest of the year could be nice and boring. Even monasteries weren't safe. Some churches elected a boy bishop on December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, who led processions and delivered mock sermons. This wasn't just for laughs. It was symbolic. The child's innocent wisdom was seen as closer to divine truth. Also, it was hilarious to watch a 12-year-old try to pronounce incarnation. The Lord of Misrule also encouraged wild dances, drinking games, and bizarre costumes. In noble courts, people wore animal masks, cross-dressed or dressed as devils, saints, or biblical figures. Often all three in one room. Think of it like medieval Halloween with a Christmas playlist. Of course, the church had mixed feelings. Some clergy tried to rein it in, especially when the festivities got too. But they also understood that medieval life was hard, and letting people cut loose within limits helped keep the peace. Plus, even bishops liked a good fruits cake. So, while you might stress over holiday decor or awkward family dinners, remember, medieval people had a designated agent of chaos running the show. And his entire mission was to make Christmas as weird, wild, and upside down as humanly possible. If a group of medieval carolers showed up at your door today, you'd probably call security. Back then, caroling was less about angelic harmonies and more about demanding food and booze in exchange for not making a scene. Picture it: drunken peasants belting out tunes while waving tankers and possibly a goose. The term carol originally meant a circular dance accompanied by singing, and many Christmas carols started as secular folk songs with lyrics that were occasionally a bit. Over time, these were adopted, rewritten, or sanitized by the church to reflect more pious themes. But even the most devout carolers knew that singing was only half the tradition. The other half was collecting your reward, where selling was the main vehicle for this festive extortion. Groups would go from house to house, singing songs and offering a toast of hot mulled cider or ale, and in return they expected food, drink, or money. If you didn't cough it up, the carolers might keep singing louder or worse improvised verses about your stinginess. Yes, they were the medieval version of Yelp reviewers, but with bells. This wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Nobles often had food and drink ready. for passing carolers, and peasants saw it as a rare chance to visit their betters and maybe sneak a few meat pies. There was even an air of ritual to it. People believed that welcoming carolers and sharing food brought luck and blessings for the new year. Slamming the door in their faces, not advised. Ours. Bad harvests were blamed on worse manners. The songs themselves varied, okay? Some were about the nativity, others about saints, and many were just about drinking, okay? One popular favorite was Bring Us in Good Ale, which has a chorus that shocker requests good ale. Another classic, the Boar's Head Carol, sung as a roasted pig's head was triumphantly carried into the hall like a meaty trophy. So, while modern caroling is a quaint nod to tradition, medieval caroling was part community ritual, part bar crawl, part low-grade shakedown. And it wasn't limited to the 12 days of Christmas. It often stretched well into January, depending on how much beer people still had. Before scented candles and electric fireplaces, there was the oulé log, a hunk of real, unapologetically massive timber dragged into the hall and set ablaze with almost religious ceremony. In fact, the log was so large that medieval houses often had to leave part of it sticking out of the hearth. They'd just shove it in further as it burned like a flaming breadstick of seasonal joy. This wasn't just about staying warm. The Yule log had deep symbolic roots, many of them suspiciously pagan, so it was believed to ward off evil spirits, bring good luck, and even predict the future based on how the flames flickered. The ashes were often saved and spread on fields for fertility or kept in the home to protect against lightning strikes. Yes, lightning. Medieval logic was part magic, part superstition, and 100% committed. Lighting the log was a big deal. Often, they used embers from the previous year's oulé log, a tradition that symbolized continuity, prosperity, and, let's be honest, fire, safety, anxiety to light it. With new fire was bad luck, like hitting shuffle on your family's destiny playlist. You wanted that slow, familiar burn. The log itself was chosen with care. Sometimes a whole tree was selected in advance and chopped down specifically for the occasion. Wealthy households might decorate it with ribbons, greenery, or even dust it with wine. It was meant to last all 12 nights of Christmas. And if it went out too early, bad omen. Hope you didn't like your livestock too much. Gathering around the oulé log was a social event. People would drink, sing, tell stories, and roast chestnuts, turn the hearth into the literal and metaphorical center of Christmas life. Kids were told tales of what might crawl down the chimney if they misbehaved, while adults passed around mugs of wassail and swapped gossip with a side of pork. Though the oulé log tradition has mostly vanished, except in cake form, it once symbolized warmth, community, and the magical suspension of rules that Christmas brought. It was, in short, the medieval version of Netflix in a crackling fireplace, but with fewer marshmallows and more goats. When it comes to Christmas presents, medieval folks would be confused by wrapping paper, boughs, and Amazon wish lists. Gift giving did exist, but it wasn't the central event it is today. And it certainly wasn't on Christmas Day. That honor usually went to New Year's Day or Epiphany, January 6th, depending on local custom and which saint you were trying to impress. And forget the one big present idea. Gifts tended to be symbolic rather than extravagant. A noble might gift a falcon or a book. A servant might receive gloves, food, or, if they were lucky, a coin. Children might get nuts, apples, or, if someone was feeling generous, a toy carved from wood. Gold-plated Xbox. Not quite. But hey, nothing says, I love you like a handful of walnuts. Canes, however, were another story. The medieval 12 days of Christmas were practically invented for rowdy entertainment, ranging from dice and card games to full-blown outdoor sports that usually ended with someone in a ditch. Hoodman, blind, a version of blind man's bluff. Cockles, which involved blindfolds and slapping, don't ask. And wrestling matches were common. If it involved competition, mild violence, or theatrical flair, it made the holiday cut. Board games also had their place. Chess was popular among the nobility, as was Alqueer, a precursor to checkers. But even these were often played with a heavy mug of ale nearby, which is probably why medieval chessboards were found under tables more often than on them. For those more inclined to theatricality, there were mummers, plays, masked performances put on by roving groups of amateur actors. These were chaotic, semi-improvised dramas, often involving themes of death and resurrection, dragons, saints, and the occasional dancing devil. Think medieval soap opera with a script written by your drunk uncle. And, let's not forget, charades, riddles, and riddling contests, a favorite pastime in noble courts. Losers might have to chug ale, recite an embarrassing poem, or wear something ridiculous like a pig's snout tied to their nose with string, which, to be fair, still sounds better than most off a Secret Santa. So, while medieval Christmas gifts were modest, the spirit of play and mischief made the season rich in other ways. It was a time when laughter and games had their rightful place next to prayer and roast swan, and often got a bit more attention. Amidst all the drunken, wassailing, roasted horse and men in goat costumes declaring themselves kings for a day, there was still the matter of the birth of Christ, which was technically the whole reason for the season. In the medieval world, Christmas was both holy day and holiday, and few things captured the sacred side more than midnight mass. At the stroke of midnight on December 25th, villagers, nobles, cool, and monks would bundle up and trudge through the cold, often through snow and mud, to attend a solemn, candlelit service. The church bells would ring, echoing over thatched rooftops and frosted fields. Inside the church was transformed, filled with incense, flickering candles, and evergreen branches woven into garlands. If you were lucky, a choir might chant in Latin. If you were really lucky, the choir boys wouldn't be hungover from sneaking ale the night before. Midnight Mass was one of 3 masses celebrated that day. Yes, 3. The first at midnight symbolized Christ's eternal birth from the Father. The second, at dawn, represented his birth from the Virgin Mary. The third, in broad daylight, celebrated his birth into the hearts of believers. In short, tripled the symbolism, tripled the sitting on cold stone benches. These services were not quick affairs. Gregorian chants, processions, readings in Latin, and for the illiterate masses. That meant a lot of standing, nodding solemnly, and trying to figure out which saint they were supposed to be focusing on. Still, it was a major communal event. Even peasants who rarely saw the inside of a church might show up for Christmas Mass, if only to feel connected to something divine between ale-fueled revelries. Churches often staged nativity plays, complete with Mary, Joseph, angels, shepherds, king, and sometimes a real baby or a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth depending on availability and baby willingness. These plays were meant to be reverent, but often ended up with comic relief. Tradition that continues to this day every time someone forgets their line or a sheep escapes. In a world where life was unpredictable, brutal, and short, Christmas Mass offered something transcendent, a moment of peace, awe, and light in the darkest part of the year. It was the anchor that held the chaos together. That and maybe one last round of mulled wine. After 12 days of feasting, singing, drinking, and institutionalized absurdity, the medieval Christmas season ended with a final bang. The Feast of the Epiphany, celebrated on January 6th. It marked the arrival of the 3 Magi, or wise men, who came bearing gifts for the newborn Christ. For medieval folks, it also marked the moment when you had to stop pretending that eating swan in your underwear while watching Mass perform was normal behavior. Epiphany was a major feast day, nearly as significant as Christmas itself. The churches pulled out all the stops: incense, processions, chanting, symbolic, offerings, and in some regions, blessing the water and homes with holy chalk to protect against evil. It was the last sacred horror before the long, cold slog of ordinary life resumed. But don't worry, the chaos hadn't fully burned itself out yet. In many places, Epiphany featured the 12th night celebrations, which were the most raucous of all. There was music, masking, gift-giving, and sometimes full-on theatrical madness. A king and queen of the bean were crowned, chosen by who found a dried bean or pea hidden inside a cake. The lucky finder got to rule the feast, boss people around, and wear a paper crown. It was part satire, part social catharsis, and part excuse to yell, "All hail the pea queen." The food on Epiphany was as grand as ever. Roast meats, pies, and especially the 12th cake, ancestor to today's king cake, usually filled with dried fruit, sugar, and a few questionable surprises. At this point, everyone was bloated, possibly hungover, and vaguely aware that Lent would eventually ruin everything. For children, Epiphany was sometimes the day for receiving gifts, a reflection of the Magi bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. For adults, it was the last socially acceptable day to flirt with a jester or wear a devil mask to church. And when the feast was over, the decorations came. Down, the Ule log was extinguished, its ashes often kept for good luck, and people returned to their usual lives of toil, prayer, and trying not to die of dysentery. The medieval Christmas season was over. 12 days of inverted order, holy reverence, drunken misrule, and communal joy, gone until next year. But what a ride it was for Christmas. Before Ule logs and gingerbread men, there was Saturnalia, the Roman festival, so rowdy and upside down that it makes modern holiday office parties look like silent prayer. Held in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture, time, and generations. Saturnalia was a festival of reversal, chaos, and celebration, and it all began on December 17th. In theory, Saturnalia started as a simple religious observance. The Temple of Saturn on the Capitoline Hill was the central stage. Priests offered sacrifices, unveiled the statue of Saturn, which was usually bound in wool, and let the god run free. But by the time the Republic gave way to empire, the ritual had exploded into a citywide week of licensed misbehavior. Shops and schools closed. Public business ground to a halt. Courts refused to hear cases. Even the Senate found more excuses than usual not to show up. No wars were declared. No battles fought. For once, the Roman machine paused, and everyone took a deep breath before diving headfirst into drunken feasting, dice games, and cross-dressing. Okay, here's the fun part. The Romans loved role reversals. Masters served slaves. Senators wore silly hats. Everyone swapped their togas for colorful leisure wear called synthesis. It's basically ancient party robes. Even the usually rigid Roman class system got a temporary makeover. Freedmen mocked their patrons. Women played men in street skits. Slaves sat at banquets while their owners waited on them, all while pretending the world had always been this way. This wasn't just tolerated. It was ritualized chaos sanctioned by the gods themselves. Homes and public buildings were decorated with garlands, wreaths, and candles. There were no solemn hymns, only laughter, music, and the clatter of dice rolling on marble. People gave gifts, wax figurines, gag presents, and small tokens called sigillaria, the Roman equivalent of Secret Santa robe. Saturnalia wasn't merely indulgent. It was Rome's way of pressing pause on the imperial rat race and letting people breathe, eat, gamble, mock the rich, and pretend, just for a few days, that time belonged to Saturn, not Caesar. If you were a Roman slave, there was one time of year when you could finally kick your feet up, sip some wine, and bark orders at your master without fear of being flogged. A time with Saturnalia. During this wild week of role reversal, the social order was flipped on its head, and no tradition captured that better than the moment masters served their slaves. It wasn't just symbolic. This was a full-blown, ritualized inversion of power. Slaves could dress like free citizens, speak freely, crack jokes at their owner's expense, and even dine at the same table, or in many households at the head of it. Meanwhile, their masters were expected to serve them food and wine, play the fool, and generally pretend they didn't run the empire the other 358 days of the year. Some households took it further, holding mock elections to name a king of Saturnalia, often chosen from among the slaves. This temporary monarch had the power to command ridiculous tasks: sing a song about a goat, drink 3 cups of wine while standing on one leg. Think of it as a cross between a jester and a dictator, except with more garlands and fewer consequences. Was it all in good fun? Yes, but it was also deeply political and cathartic. In a society built on inequality, Saturnalia offered a rare moment for the powerless to push back, even if only in jest. For slaves, this wasn't just entertainment. It was relief, a temporary break in the grinding monotony of servitude. For masters, it was a reminder that their power was not divine. It was tolerated, fragile, and maybe a little ridiculous when viewed from the bottom up. Of course, the illusion didn't last. After the festival ended, the roles snapped back like a cruel rubber band. But for those few days, laughter replaced commands, satire replaced fear, and Rome, for all its grandeur, remembered what it was like to let go of control and to laugh at itself. It was, in a way, Rome's pressure valve, a moment of ritualized rebellion that made the strict order of daily life slightly more bearable. If there was ever a time in Rome to break the rules loudly and with wine-stained tunics, it was Saturnalia. Gambling, normally frowned upon in polite society, became not only acceptable, but expected. Men, women, and even children grabbed dice or knucklebones and bet coins, food, or ridiculous dares. Even slaves, who were usually banned from betting altogether, joined in on the action, and sometimes even cleaned out their masters' purses. As taverns overflowed, private homes became mini casinos, and the clatter of dice on marble floors was practically the background music of the season. Roman dice games weren't just about luck, they were about rebellion. Playing them openly during Saturnalia was like publicly declaring, for this 1 week I answer to no one, not even Jupiter. And of course, no Roman festival would be complete without enough alcohol to flow to GI. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with honey, spices, or herbs, which made it taste more like medicine, but also like something that needed to be consumed in bulk. There were no toasts to moderation. People drank to Saturn, to freedom, to each other, and often to the ceiling. Drunken singing in the streets, absolutely. Public dancing, yes. Wearing wreaths made of ivy and stumbling into a fountain, practically encouraged. Saturnalia gave Romans an excuse to behave like the exact opposite of their usual stoic, virtue-obsessed selves. Respectable citizens wore bright robes instead of white togas. Senators played the lyre badly in public. Women told dirty jokes and were applauded for it. Chastity, seriousness, and control were tossed out the window with the same enthusiasm as yesterday's bread crusts. Some even called Saturnalia the best of days because it allowed people to be their truest selves. Messy, loud, emotional, and slightly off-key. The wild behavior wasn't seen as sinful. It was seen as necessary. Just as the earth needed to be tilled and let rest, so too did the Roman spirit. And for that 1 week, it was perfectly acceptable to be irresponsible, gloriously, unapologetically irresponsible. After all, what was the worst that could happen? You'd just go back to being a respectable citizen next week. At the heart of the Saturnian madness was a crowned fool with too much power and not enough sense, the king of Saturnalia, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule. This temporary monarch was chosen, often from the lowest social ranks, or even a slave, to preside over the festivities, like a drunken god in a laurel wreath. The role's simple command: chaos. Once crowned, the king could issue ridiculous, often humiliating orders, and everyone was expected to obey. Dance like a donkey. Sing a love song to that fruit bowl. Cite Cicero while hiccuping. Guests at the feast had to follow through, or else risk being laughed off the couch. This wasn't just a gag. It was ritualized subversion. The king was meant to embody the spirit of Saturn himself: freedom, fertility, disorder. By putting the least powerful person in charge, Romans symbolically overturned their strict social order. The master became servant, and the fool became sovereign, just for a little while. And in that topsy-turvy kingdom, the laws of dignity did not apply. The choice of king was often made by hiding a bean or coin inside a cake. Whoever bit into it became royalty for the night. This tradition would later echo through Europe as the king cake custom during Epiphany and other winter feasts. But the Romans weren't thinking about Christian holidays. They were thinking about who looked funniest in a crown made of vines. Sometimes the role carried a darker tone. In earlier centuries, it may have been tied to older, grim fertility rites, where the mock king might actually be sacrificed at the end of his reign. Thankfully, by the imperial period, the worst fate awaiting the king of Saturnalia was a pounding hangover and some very embarrassing stories. And when the festival ended, so did the king's reign. The fool took off his crown, the servants went back to serving, and the absurdity faded into memory, leaving behind only laughter, leftover wine, and perhaps a slightly bruised ego. Still, for that brief moment, a slave could command a senator, and all of Rome would cheer. He thought giving sucks. 4. Christmas was disappointing. Try receiving a wax figurine shaped like a turnip. Welcome to Satinia gift giving, where the presents were cheap, funny, and absolutely overflowing with chaotic charm. Unlike the lavish gift giving of today, Satinia gifts, called sigillaria, were small, personal, and often downright silly. These were little wax or clay figurines, joke items, trinkets, or even edible goodies like nuts, dates, and pastries. Some gifts were meant to flatter, others were designed to mock, and a few were clearly last-minute grabs from the nearest market stall. It wasn't about extravagance, it was about symbolism and sentiment. The gift said, "I acknowledge you. I celebrate with you. And here's a tiny wooden fist for luck." Yes, phallic charms were popular Saturnalia gifts believed to bring fertility, protection, and laughter. Probably not safe for your office secret Santa. Romans loved gifting candles, too, symbolizing light returning after the darkest days of the year. Think of them as the ancient version of seasonal affective disorder lamps. Handwritten verses or witty jokes were also common, making this the one time of year when being a sarcastic poet actually paid off. Children, of course, loved Satinia. It was one of the rare times they were not only indulged with sweets and toys, but also allowed to participate fully in adult festivities, gambling, joking, even bossing their elders around for fun. 4. A Roman kid. This was basically winning the cultural lottery, but just because the gifts were modest didn't mean they weren't meaningful. A thoughtful sigillarium could reflect your relationship, your sense of humor, or how much wine you'd already had when you picked it out. Some aristocrats even used it as an excuse to hand out favors or cash to clients, a gesture of generosity disguised as tradition. Gift-giving usually happened on or around December 19th during the height of the celebrations. And much like today, it came with stress, expectations, and the occasional passive-aggressive response. "Oh, another walnut figurine. How original." So, next time you're stressing over holiday shopping, remember, the Romans kept it simple. It's 1 week of jokes, trinkets, and phallic candles, and nobody asked for a gift receipt. Satania had a dress code. It was do the opposite of what you normally would. then a culture obsessed with dignity, tradition, and clean toggers. This was the week when everyone threw on party robes, messed up their hair, and wrapped themselves in ivy. Literally, forget crisp white toggers. During Saturnalia, Romans wore the synthesis, a colorful, informal robe, usually reserved for dining at home. It was like showing up to a black-tie gala in a bathrobe, and everyone clapped, paired with a palliasse, a floppy cone-shaped cap symbolizing freedom. This outfit was the ancient equivalent of holiday pajamas and a Santa hat. The decor matched the mood. Homes, temples, and even shop fronts were covered in garlands, greenery, candles, and hanging wreaths. Evergreen branches symbolized life in the darkest days of winter. Ivy and holly, yes, the same stuff we use now, made appearances. Saturnalia wasn't just wild, it was surprisingly aesthetic. Not wow. Everything looked festive. There was an undercurrent of mischief. Romans took this opportunity to gently, or not so gently, mock the gods, the Senate, and each other. Sacred symbols were parodied. Processions featured men dressed as Jupiter or Bacchus, behaving like drunken fools. One Saturnalia even saw a mock triumph parade featuring a donkey wearing a laurel crown. Why? Because Saturn said so. Even religion got flipped on its head. Saturn's statue, usually bound in woolen cords to symbolize restraint, was symbolically freed during the festival. He was released from his bindings, just as the people were released from theirs, from work, from roles, from the usual grind of Roman life. And let's not forget the songs and chants which filled the streets with equal parts joy and mild blasphemy. Saturnalia tunes ranged from silly drinking chants to bawdy parodies of traditional hymns and caroling, but with more wine and less theology. It was in essence a holy festival of unholiness. For 1 week, order was mocked, rules were relaxed, and everyone played pretend, not to tear society down, but to remind themselves that life didn't always have to be serious. Even in the heart of the Roman Empire, joy had a place. It's easy to look at Saturnalia and see nothing but drunken dice games and toga-based karaoke. But beneath the chaos, there were ancient sacred roots, and they were surprisingly serious. Saturnalia wasn't invented by the Romans just to party. It evolved from deep agricultural and religious traditions tied to Saturn, one of Rome's oldest and most complex gods. Saturn was more than just the god of farming. It represented a mythical golden age, a time when humanity lived in peace, equality, and plenty. There were no kings, no slaves, no wars, just free people farming fertile land under a just and generous deity. In that version of history, Saturn ruled with wisdom and the world was fair. By the time Rome built the Temple of Saturn in the Forum in 497 BCE, the Golden Age was long gone, but people still longed for it. So once a year, they tried to bring it back. Saturnalia was a ritual reenactment of that perfect past. For 1 week, hierarchy was suspended, wealth was shared, and laughter replaced law. It wasn't just about mischief, it was spiritual nostalgia. The festival always began with a sacrifice at Saturn's temple, followed by a public banquet in front of it. Anyone could join, regardless of status. Priests unveiled Saturn's statue, unbinding the woolen ropes that normally restrained it all year. This act of freeing the god symbolized the loosening of cosmic and social order and served as the divine permission slip to go absolutely feral for the next 7 days. Even the date was significant. Late December marked the winter solstice, the darkest time of the year. Saturnalia welcomed the sun's return with light, fire, greenery, and joy. The candles that Romans gifted each other weren't just practical, they were symbols of hope and rebirth. While Saturnalia may have looked like an excuse to get drunk in public and shout at statues, it was also a sacred reminder, a glimpse, fleeting and chaotic, of the world as it once was, or might be again. A world without class, without oppression, where freedom reigned and the gods walked among the people. When early Christians started carving out space for their own winter holiday, they faced a problem. Saturnalia was incredibly popular. You can try preaching humility and spiritual rebirth all you want, okay? But if the neighbors are across the street wearing ivy crowns, gambling, and handing out nuts, people might start rethinking their weekend plans. So, what did the church do? It borrowed liberally. While Saturnalia was gradually phased out as the empire Christianized, many of its traditions didn't die. They just rebranded. The date of Christmas, set on December 25th, conveniently overlaps with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which itself followed right on the heels of Saturnalia. Whether by coincidence or strategy, the timing aligned perfectly. And with that timing came some carryovers: gift-giving, Saturnalia decorating with greenery and candles, Saturnalia wearing silly hats, and reversing roles in pageants. Saturnalia, again, even the boisterous communal feasting found its way into medieval Christmas celebrations, minus the public nudity most of the time. In fact, some early Christian leaders were furious about the overlap, okay? They condemned believers for treating Christ's birth like a pagan party. St. Augustine famously warned against Christians celebrating with drunkenness and dancing. Spoiler alert, nobody listened. By the Middle Ages, elements of Saturnalia had merged seamlessly into Christmas customs. The Lord of Misrule in English Christmas, a direct descendant of the Saturnia king, the Twelfth Night Revelry, straight out of Roman winter feasts, okay? In the tradition of exchanging gifts on or around Christmas was deeply rooted in the old Roman practice of handing out sigillaria during the festival. Even today, some Saturnalia echoes still linger in the chaotic family dinners. The laughter, the feeling of time off, and the idea that for a short while we all deserve joy in a bit of disorder. When the final dice clattered across the marble floor, the last goblet of wine was drained, and the king of Saturnalia stumbled off his makeshift throne. The Roman world faced a sobering truth. Saturnalia was over as quickly as the chaos had begun. Order snapped back into place. Masters reclaimed their authority. Slaves returned to their stations. Togas replaced the colorful synthesis robes, and Roman seriousness returned like a parent turning the lights on at a teenager's party. It was a jarring transition. The week had allowed everyone from senators to slaves to revel in freedom, mock power, and live without consequence. But Rome, for all its decadence, thrived on structure, and Saturnalia was never meant to destroy that structure, only to release the pressure that built beneath it. Like steam from a bathhouse, it had to be let out before the walls cracked. The end of Saturnalia also marked the symbolic return of Saturn to his bindings. The god statue at the temple was once again tied with woolen cords, representing the resublishment of discipline, control, and cosmic order. The Golden Age was packed up like a party decoration, not gone, but definitely postponed for another year. For the average Roman, the aftermath came with a hangover, literal or spiritual. Some returned to their routines reluctantly, nursing sore heads and emptier purses after too many wages. Others seemed relieved, eager to restore social roles that had temporarily dissolved. And, for slaves, Saturnalia was bittersweet, a rare taste of dignity and joy, followed by the return to chains. Writers like Seneca noted the excesses, while others, like Macrobius, documented the deeper meanings. They knew Saturnalia was more than indulgence. It was a reflection of Rome's strange genius, the ability to uphold authority while mocking it, to rule an empire while giving it 1 week to act like a drunken toddler. And yet, Saturnalia never truly vanished. Even after the rise of Christianity and the fall of the Western Empire, its spirit lingered, evolving, blending, transforming into the very DNA of our modern winter holidays. Because every civilization, no matter how disciplined, needs a little chaos. And every calendar, no matter how strict, needs a week when the world turns upside down and laughs at itself. In the medieval world, there was no doctor waiting on horseback, no hospital wing ready with warm linens. When a woman went into labor, whether in a peasant's age veil or a noblewoman's chamber, it was the midwife who was called, often in the middle of the night, often with little notice, and almost always with life or death stakes. The midwife wasn't licensed, rarely educated in the formal sense, and almost never paid what she was worth. But in the eyes of her community, she was vital. Without her, birth was not only painful, it was lethal. In some villages, she might be the only person with any experience in childbirth, and even the parish priest wouldn't question her presence when the screams began. She carried no diploma, just a satchel of herbs, oils, linens, and hard-earned experience. Her training came from other women, older midwives, family members, or sheer repetition. She might have started as an assistant, passing cloths and holding hands, learning when to wait and when to act. Her classroom was the birthing mat, her textbook, blood, and breath. Her days were full of contradictions. She was both honored and feared, welcomed into homes during sacred moments, and then pushed to the margins when suspicions rose. A healthy baby and mother meant celebration, stillbirth or hemorrhage that could turn her from healer to suspect. People in the 1200s to 1400s didn't understand germs or uterine rupture, but they did understand blame, and if a woman died, someone had to carry it. Still, the midwife endured. She navigated superstition as deftly as she handled breech births. A charm against the evil eye here, a whispered prayer to Saint Margaret there. She might draw a protective circle with chalk, or place a knife under the bed to ward off spirits. She didn't believe in magic, not exactly, but she did believe in anything that might help. She was always on call. No rest, no luxury, just urgency, sweat, and the quiet pressure of being the first to touch a life, or the last to see it leave. And yet, she was never the story's heroine. She was its anchor, uncredited but unshakable. There were no textbooks, no classrooms, and certainly no medical diplomas waiting at the end to become a midwife in the 13th or 14th century. A woman learned the craft the same way she might learn to bake bread or mend a roof, by watching, helping, and eventually doing. It was an apprenticeship not of theory, but of lived, often traumatic experience. Usually, a young girl would begin her training by shadowing an older midwife, a mother, aunt, or respected elder in the village. She started by preparing the birthing room, stoking the fire, boiling water, laying out clean cloths. Then she watched, not from the back of the room, but up close, watching a woman groan and sweat and scream as new life tore its way into the world. It wasn't sanitized. It was real, loud, bloody, and terrifying. And for many young girls, that was the moment they either committed or turned back forever. If she stayed, she would soon be helping directly, cleaning the baby, tying off the cord, applying herbs to the mother's torn flesh. Slowly, under the older midwife's guidance, she'd learned to recognize danger, the way a mother's breath changed before she fainted from blood loss, or the ominous silence that meant the baby hadn't taken its first breath. It was an oral tradition. Nothing was written down, especially not in Latin, which most women couldn't read anyway. Midwives passed knowledge like folklore, wrapped in stories, warnings, and superstitions. Don't cut the cord before the afterbirth comes, one might say. Put rosemary under her pillow to keep the devil away. Every piece of advice came from somewhere, and often it worked. Her first solo birth would be a baptism by fire. The mother lived. If the baby cried, if the bleeding stopped, only then would she start to earn trust. And it wasn't just about technique. A midwife needed nerve, compassion, and the ability to stay calm while others panicked. She didn't have the luxury of uncertainty. By the time she was accepted by the village, she would already have held life in one hand and death in the other. Still, she would show up at the next birth with chapped hands, aching joints, and eyes that had already seen too much. A medieval midwife didn't have scalpels, forceps, or antiseptic. But that didn't mean she came empty-handed. The toolkit was humble, improvised, carried with the quiet confidence of someone who'd used it 100 times before. It was a mix of natural remedies, superstitious protections, and hard-earned instinct. First came the herbs, the midwife's version of a medicine cabinet. She knew which ones could ease pain, which could stop bleeding, and which could coax a reluctant uterus into action. Pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow, and shepherd's purse were among her favorites, boiled into teas, ground into picuses, or burned for their aroma. Each plant had its place. Some were genuinely effective, others more symbolic, but they were all part of the ritual. It's carried swaddling cloths, often soaked in vinegar or wine to disinfect. Not that anyone in the 13th century understood bacteria, but they had noticed that wine seemed to help. She also brought oil, usually olive or almond, to massage the mother's belly or ease tearing. A small, sharp knife or pair of shears was used to cut the cord. And if the child wasn't breathing, the midwife might suck mucus from its nose or swing it gently to stimulate a cry. Then there were the charms and talismans. Not everyone approved, especially the church, but most women preferred to hedge their bets. A small carved image of Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth, might be placed near the bed. Some midwives wore protective amulets around their necks. Others etched crosses into the lintel or slipped iron needles into the straw mattress to keep evil spirits at bay. Midwives also relied on positioning and touch. They learned how to feel the baby's position through the belly, how to turn up each child by hand, and how to reposition a laboring woman to relieve pressure or restart a stalled birth. There were no fetal monitors, no ultrasounds, just intuition, observation, and deep physical familiarity with the female body, in the face of blood, fear, and screaming pain. The medieval midwife had only what she could carry and what she had carried in her memory. That was enough. Childbirth in the medieval world was not a gentle affair. It was loud, painful, unpredictable, and far more dangerous than most people today can imagine. The midwife stood at the center of this storm, not as a doctor in control, but as a witness and guide, trying to steer two lives through a needle's eye with nothing more than her hands and her resolve. Medieval births often took place in dimly lit, smoky rooms, sometimes with a fire roaring and windows shuttered to keep out evil spirits. Women gave birth not lying down, but squatting or sitting on a birthing stool surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, and perhaps a servant or two. Men were usually banished. The space belonged to women, and the midwife ruled it like a quiet queen. The midwife watched for signs, the way the woman breathed, how the belly shifted, the look in her eyes when the pain changed from early contractions to something deeper. She knew how to listen for silence. Silence could mean the baby was stuck or the mother was bleeding too much. She moved quickly but calmly, issuing orders in a firm tone, her fingers always working. When things went well, the child came cleanly. The mother's tears turned to laughter and the room filled with relief. But often the midwife had to act fast. A hemorrhage meant stuffing clean rags or even her own hand into the womb. A baby not breathing. She'd try rubbing, warming, swinging, even breathing into its mouth. Not from science, but from tradition and desperation. Stillbirths and maternal deaths were common. When they happened, the midwife didn't cry. She cleaned the mother's body, wrapped the child, and said a prayer. If the baby was dying and not yet baptized, she'd perform an emergency baptism herself, often using wine or even saliva if no holy water was on hand. One act, forbidden by the church, but widely practiced, might save a soul in the eyes of the grieving. Midwives were not miracle workers, but they fought like warriors against pain, against blood loss, against the shadow of death hanging just outside the cottage door. And sometimes they won, and that was enough to keep going. In the Middle Ages, the line between life and death was razor thin, and nowhere was it more visible than in the hands of the midwife. She didn't just deliver babies, she sometimes baptized them too. That put her in a strange and delicate position, part healer, part spiritual, gatekeeper, part scapegoat. The church taught that unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven. They were doomed to limbo, not punished, but forever cut off from divine light, in towns where a priest might be several miles away, or unreachable during a long winter night. The midwife was the only one present to act. And so, if a baby emerged, blue or not breathing, she would sprinkle wine, water, or even her own spit on the child's head and murmur the sacred words, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." Technically, this wasn't allowed. Baptism was a priest's job, but practically everyone looked the other way. It was better to save a soul than follow every rule. Still, the midwife's actions came at a price. If the baby died, baptized or not, and especially if the mother also passed, suspicion often followed. People might whisper, did she use the wrong herbs? Did she delay the birth? Was she in league with darker forces? The line between folk knowledge and witchcraft was as blurry as the boundaries of theology. And because midwives used herbal remedies, incantations, and charms that weren't always sanctioned by the church, they were vulnerable to accusations. A woman who had saved dozens of lives could be turned into a suspect by a single bad outcome. Worse, if the baptism failed or wasn't performed at all, the grief of the family could curdle into rage. The midwife might be banned, punished, or even reported to local authorities. For many women in her role, especially in towns where superstition ran hot, just doing her job could put her at risk. And yet, she continued, because while everyone else panicked over theology, the midwife knew what really mattered. The scream of a living child, the rise and fall of a mother's chest, and the simple, sacred relief of another soul safely born. The medieval midwife lived in a constant balancing act, not just between life and death, but between faith and suspicion. On one side stood the church with its priests, rituals, and male-dominated hierarchy. On the other stood the midwife's folk knowledge, herbal law, and the quiet power of women's community wisdom. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter, never written, always watched. The church had mixed feelings about midwives. They weren't necessary. Yes, no male priest was going to deliver a baby in a peasant's hut, but they were also feared. Why? Because they operated outside the church's direct control. They handled births alone. They made decisions about baptism, whispered prayers that weren't always Latin. Some clerics tried to bring midwives under official sanction. In some dioceses, they were forced to take oaths promising never to use magic, never to perform abortion, and never to speak blasphemy in the birthing room. Others were interrogated or denied communion if there were rumors or simply if a baby died on their watch. Yet most midwives weren't heretics or witches. They were practical women trying to help mothers survive childbirth with the tools they had. Yes, they knew about herbs that could end a pregnancy, or salves that soothed fevers. But they weren't stirring cauldrons in the woods at midnight. They were boiling water in kitchens, tying cords with trembling hands, and facing the screams of labor alone. That didn't stop accusations. In the later 14th century, especially as Europe entered the pre-Reformation period, fear of witches began to rise, and midwives with their hands-on knowledge of the female body became easy targets. Some were blamed for miscarriages, deformities, even infertility. If a birth went wrong, people asked, was it the mother's sin, or did the midwife let the devil in? The irony, it's very practices that kept women alive, herbal remedies, quiet chants, protective charms, were the same. Ones that might get her branded a witch. So the midwife walked a careful line. She crossed herself before placing a charm, mentioned saints while mixing herbs, and made sure every act of healing looked like a prayer. she wasn't just delivering babies, she was delivering herself from suspicion every single time. In an age when women were birthing room was one of the few places they truly ruled. Okay? No men allowed unless things went catastrophically wrong. Here, in the tight, sweaty confines of a peasant's home or a noblewoman's chamber, the midwife presided over a world built by women for women, and it was held together by pain, prayer, and the power of companionship. Birth was not a solitary experience. Women gave birth surrounded by a birthing circle, a trusted group of female neighbors, a sister, an aunt, maybe even the local AU wife or healer. These women weren't there just to watch, okay? They helped hold the mother up, massaged her back, brought hot cloths, whispered encouragement, and sang old songs, lobbies meant for unborn ears. At the center of it all stood the midwife, directing, guiding, commanding with quiet authority. She wasn't always gentle. Sometimes she had to shout over screams, slap a face to bring a woman back from panic, or bark orders for more hot water. But she also knew how to soothe with a glance, a story, or a worn-down charm passed from hand to hand. This circle of women was more than practical. It was spiritual armor. Labor was dangerous. It could kill. So, the presence of familiar, trusted faces helped the laboring mother stay grounded. Midwives sometimes led group prayers or chants, or even staged rituals of protection, binding a ribbon around the mother's wrist, lighting candles to the Virgin, or pouring wine onto the earth to appease whatever spirits might be lurking nearby. And when the baby finally arrived, wet, wailing, alive, it wasn't just the mother who rejoiced. The whole circle cheered, wept, and crossed themselves. There was laughter, relief, maybe even bread and ale passed around if things had gone well. In a world that rarely offered women control, the birthing room was a rare realm of female power, okay? And the midwife was its guardian, not just of the baby, but of the bonds between women, woven through centuries of shared knowledge, whispered secrets, and fierce love. Being a medieval midwife wasn't a calling born of wealth. It was grueling, thankless, and often unpaid, or at best, compensated in bread, chickens, or promises. And yet, for many women, it was one of the few respectable ways to gain status, purpose, and a modest livelihood in a society that offered them almost none. Most midwives were not part of the nobility. They were peasant women, tradeswomen, or widows who had built up reputations over years of service. In cities, some gained local fame, even being appointed as official parish midwives. But in villages, they were often treated as half healers, half helpers, expected to serve whenever summoned. Payment, when it came, was inconsistent. In wealthier towns, some women received small sums of coin, or gifts of wine, wool, or candles. But more often, payment was a promise. We'll give you a chicken at harvest, or you'll get bread from the next bake. And if the child or mother died, that promise could vanish, or worse, turn into accusations or cold silence. Despite this, a good midwife could build a quiet kind of power. She was respected, feared, needed. Women trusted her more than any priest, especially when the pain of childbirth hit and no male authority could offer comfort. Over time, if she avoided scandal and built a record of successful births, she became part of the village fabric, the one women whispered about with awe, the one they called even before their labor started. Some cities, particularly by the late 1300s, began to formalize midwifery. In places like France and parts of Germany, midwives were occasionally examined or licensed by male physicians or clerics, a dubious mix of medicine and moral policing. But even then, they were rarely paid well. The status was symbolic, the risk very real, and yet, despite the exhaustion, the irregular income, and the suspicion that always lingered nearby, the midwife remained. She didn't do it for coin. She did it because no one else would or could, and because each healthy birth, each baby's first cry, was a small, sacred victory that belonged to her and no one else. The life of a medieval midwife rarely ended with accolades or gravestones. No statues were carved in her honor. No books bore her name. Yet for hundreds of years, she was the quiet guardian of life, guiding generations into the world with her worn hands and weathered wisdom, and disappearing just as quietly when her work was done. Many midwives died poor and anonymous, with no formal training, no titles, and often no surviving family. Their stories faded unless preserved in parish records, court documents, or whispers. Some were buried with gratitude, their herbs and tools passed on to apprentices. Others were forgotten, or worse, remembered only if they were accused of wrongdoing during their final years. Yet, their impact rippled silently through history. Every woman who survived childbirth in a mud-floor cottage or cold stone hall owed her life to one of these women. Every healthy baby placed into swaddling cloth had first felt the hands of a midwife, hands that had already delivered dozens, perhaps hundreds before. Their knowledge, even without books, persisted. It passed through generations like folklore, which herbs to use, which prayers to whisper, which positions to try when labor stalled. The church may have tried to control them, physicians may have dismissed them, but women remembered, mothers remembered, and so their legacy lived through lineage, not letters. By the 15th century, formal medicine began to tighten its grip. Male physicians entered the birthing room. Midwifery, once the sole domain of women, was gradually redefined by men with degrees in Latin diagnosis. Many midwives were pushed aside, sometimes literally, sometimes by law. And in the centuries to come, the midwife would become a figure both romanticized and erased. But in the 1200s to 1400s, she was still the center of the storm. She walked through the blood and fear, the superstition and screams, and brought new life into the world. Not because she was invited by history, but because she was needed by life itself. And even though we don't always know their names, we remember what they did, quietly, repeatedly, bravely,